What if everything you think you know about Halloween is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide one of Europe's most terrifying supernatural traditions? While children dress as vampires and witches for candy, few realize these costumes represent an ancient fusion of dark powers that once stalked the Scottish Highlands on the most dangerous night of the year. But what happens when the vampire's thirst for blood meets the witch's hunger for souls? And why did the Celtic druids warn that on Samhain night these hybrid creatures could steal not just your life, but your very essence for an entire year? Preliminary and promise tonight, we're peeling back centuries of deliberate misdirection to uncover the true origins of Halloween's most misunderstood monsters. You see, the vampire witches of Scottish folklore weren't separate entities competing for victims. They were something far more sinister. These were practitioners of blood magic who had transcended death itself, returning each Samhain to harvest the spiritual energy needed to sustain their immortal existence. The Catholic Church spent generations burying these accounts, replacing terrifying historical testimonies with sanitized fairy tales. But buried in Gaelic manuscripts, hidden in monastery archives, and whispered through Highland oral traditions, the truth survived. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why Samhain was never about honoring the dead. It was about surviving the undead. And you'll discover why certain bloodlines still perform protective rituals every October 21st, rituals their ancestors knew could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise or joining the ranks of the eternally damned. The ancient compact. To understand vampire witches, we must first shatter the Hollywood misconceptions that have corrupted our understanding of both vampires and witches. In medieval Scotland, these weren't separate supernatural categories. They represented different stages of the same dark evolution. The transformation began with the Samhain Compact, a ritual so forbidden that speaking its name could result in excommunication. Or worse, during the harvest festivals, certain Celtic practitioners would offer their mortality in exchange for power that transcended seasonal cycles. But here's where the historical records become truly disturbing. This wasn't a metaphorical death and rebirth. Archaeological evidence from Highland burial sites reveals bodies that were ceremonially entombed alive, only to emerge during subsequent Samhain celebrations, bearing the unmistakable signs of vampiric transformation. The 12th century Chronicle of Melrose describes these beings as neither fully dead nor truly alive, sustained by the crimson essence of mortals and the spectral energies released when souls depart their earthly vessels. Unlike the solitary vampires of later folklore, these creatures operated in covens, combining their individual supernatural abilities into collective magical workings that could influence entire regions. But what made them particularly dangerous wasn't just their thirst for blood, it was their ability to drain what the Gaelic texts call anam cum hacht, the soul power that determines not just life and death, but the very capacity for spiritual existence after death. Victims didn't just die, They were spiritually annihilated, their essence absorbed to fuel the vampire witch's magical abilities for the coming year. The Samhain gathering every October 31st, as the veil between worlds grew thin, these creatures would converge at specific locations throughout the Scottish Highlands. These weren't random hunting grounds. They were carefully chosen sites where ley lines intersected with ancient burial grounds, creating what medieval chroniclers termed soul siphon points. The most notorious of these gathering places was Glen Nevis, where the Clan MacBride maintained detailed records of supernatural encounters spanning 4 centuries. According to their preserved testimonies, the vampire witches would arrive in groups of 13, their pale forms materializing from the mist like phantoms given flesh. But unlike mindless monsters, these beings demonstrated sophisticated magical knowledge, performing elaborate rituals that combined Celtic druidism with necromantic practices imported from continental Europe. Here's where the historical accounts become almost unbelievable. Witnesses consistently described the same phenomena. As midnight approached, the vampire witches would form circles around standing stones, their voices rising in chants that made the very ground tremble. Animals within miles would fall silent. The aurora borealis would appear even on cloudless nights, casting everything in an otherworldly green glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the incantations. But the true horror began when they started calling the names of local villagers, not the names on baptismal records or legal documents. They somehow knew the secret names, the ones whispered by mothers during childbirth, the ones carved into birthstones by midwives following traditions older than Christianity. When a vampire witch spoke your true name on Samhain night, you had no choice but to answer their summons, and very few returned to tell what happened next. The clan records describe entire families walking into the darkness, their eyes vacant, their movements mechanical. By dawn, only empty clothes would remain, scattered around the stone circles like discarded shells. The people themselves had simply vanished. The Blood Magic Codex, what sets vampire witches apart from ordinary supernatural predators, is their systematic approach to harvesting power. The surviving fragments of the Codex Sanguinarius, a grimoire discovered in the ruins of a 13th century Scottish monastery, reveal the terrifying sophistication of their methods. Unlike vampires who feed randomly to sustain their existence, vampire witches followed a carefully orchestrated annual cycle. Throughout the year, they would identify specific individuals whose spiritual energy matched particular magical requirements. Children born during eclipses, adults who had survived near-death experiences, elderly people whose dreams had begun bleeding into reality. All were cataloged and monitored, their spiritual signatures studied like a farmer might study crops before harvest. The Codex describes 13 distinct types of soul energy, each corresponding to different magical applications. The vis vitalis of newborns could extend the vampire witch's own immortal existence. The dolor sanctus of martyrs and saints could be transmuted into protection against holy weapons. Most disturbing of all, the sapientia mortis of those who died with unfinished business could grant the vampire witch prophetic abilities, allowing them to see potential futures and manipulate events accordingly. But gathering this energy required more than simple feeding. It demanded ritual precision. The Codex outlines elaborate ceremonies performed during the victim's final moments, involving specific incantations, symbolic tools, and timing that must align with celestial movements. A vampire witch who botched the ritual wouldn't just lose their prey. They risked being consumed by the very forces they sought to control. This explains why Samhain was so critical to their survival. The thinning veil between worlds amplified magical energy exponentially, allowing a single night's work to sustain them for an entire year. But it also meant that any mistakes made during these crucial hours could prove fatal, even to immortal beings. The Highland resistance, not everyone accepted the vampire witch's reign of terror passively. By the 14th century, certain Highland clans had developed sophisticated countermeasures, creating what historians now recognize as Europe's first organized supernatural defense network. The Clan MacLeod of Dunvegan became legendary for their anti-vampire tactics, developing weapons and strategies that combined Christian symbolism with older Celtic protective magic. Their war songs, still preserved in Gaelic oral tradition, weren't just entertainment. They were sonic weapons designed to disrupt the vampire witch's spellcasting abilities. But the MacLeod's most effective innovation was the Samhain Watch, groups of volunteers who would patrol the Highlands during Halloween night, armed with blessed silver weapons and protective amulets crafted according to pre-Christian formulas. These watchers weren't hunting the vampire witches directly. That would have been suicide. Instead, they focused on protecting potential victims, using loud bells, burning sage, and continuous prayer circles to create sacred zones that the creatures couldn't penetrate. The success of these defensive measures can be measured in blood, literally. Church records show a dramatic decrease in unexplained disappearances in territories patrolled by the Samhain Watch. But this success came at a terrible cost. The vampire witches denied their traditional hunting grounds, began targeting the watchers themselves, leading to what Gaelic bards called the Oiche na Fuil Dub, the Night of Dark Blood. According to surviving testimonies, the vampire witches adapted their tactics, using their shape-shifting abilities to infiltrate the watch groups. They would appear as fellow clansmen, as lost travelers seeking shelter, even as children separated from their families. Only when it was too late would their true nature be revealed, and by then, the sacred protective circles had been compromised from within. The monastery conspiracy. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the vampire witch phenomenon isn't their supernatural abilities. It's the evidence suggesting certain religious institutions may have actively collaborated with them the Abbey of Iona, supposedly one of Scotland's holiest sites, contains architectural features that make no sense from a purely Christian perspective. Hidden chambers beneath the chapel align perfectly with astronomical events significant to Celtic paganism. Stone carvings depicting clearly vampiric imagery are integrated into supposedly sacred decorations. Most telling of all, the abbey's foundation stones are arranged in patterns that mirror the stone circles where vampire witches performed their Samhain rituals. Medieval church records reveal a pattern of unusual disappearances around certain monasteries, always occurring during religious festivals that coincided with pagan celebrations. Novice monks would vanish during their first Samhain at the monastery. Pilgrims seeking sanctuary would be found the next morning as empty husks, their blood drained, but their bodies showing no signs of violence. The Iona manuscript, discovered in 1847 and immediately classified as forbidden by church authorities, supposedly contains first-hand accounts written by monks who witnessed these unholy alliances. According to leaked excerpts, certain abbot generals weren't trying to destroy the vampire witches. They were trying to control them, using their supernatural abilities to eliminate political enemies and heretics while maintaining plausible deniability. The manuscript describes elaborate ceremonies performed in the abbey's hidden chambers, where vampire witches would be summoned and bound through complex theological magic that twisted Christian imagery into blasphemous parodies. Crosses inverted to channel dark energy, holy water mixed with human blood to create binding agents, Latin prayers spoken backwards to reverse their meaning and purpose. If these accounts are accurate, it means the vampire witch phenomenon wasn't just tolerated by religious authorities. It was weaponized by them. The creature's annual Samhain gatherings weren't random supernatural events, but orchestrated operations designed to eliminate threats to church power while strengthening the bonds between mortal and immortal collaborators. The modern Bloodlines here is where historical investigation becomes contemporary conspiracy theory, because the vampire witch bloodlines didn't disappear with the medieval period. They adapted, evolved, and according to some researchers, continue operating today under very different circumstances. Genealogical research conducted by Dr. Fiona McBride, Otte, descendant of the same Highland clan that fought these creatures for centuries, reveals disturbing patterns in Scottish demographic records. Certain family names associated with historical vampire witch activities show unusual longevity statistics. Members of these bloodlines consistently live longer than regional averages, maintain unusually youthful appearances, and demonstrate what medical professionals politely term anomalous health markers. More troubling are the disappearances that still occur around these family seats every Halloween. The official statistics are carefully buried in bureaucratic language. People who go missing during Highland hiking trips, tourists who never checked out of their hotels, locals who simply stopped appearing in their communities. But when mapped geographically and temporally, These modern disappearances cluster around the same locations where medieval chroniclers reported vampire witch activities. The McBride research suggests these contemporary bloodlines have refined their methods considerably. Instead of obvious supernatural predation, they've learned to work within modern systems, missing person reports that get mysteriously misfiled, medical examiners who reach impossible conclusions about cause of death, law enforcement officials who seem remarkably uninterested in pursuing certain investigations. And every October 31st, while children collect candy and adults attend costume parties, those who know what to look for can still observe the old rituals. Expensive cars with tinted windows converging on remote Highland estates, private jets arriving at obscure Scottish airfields, exclusive gatherings where the guest lists read like a who's who of European nobility and American tech billionaires. The Silicon Valley connection, most shocking modern development in vampire witch research centers on Silicon Valley, where several tech companies have been quietly funding archaeological expeditions to ancient Celtic sites throughout Scotland and Ireland. These aren't academic research projects. They're systematic excavations focused specifically on recovering artifacts from known vampire witch gathering places. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed extensive underground networks beneath stone circles that were previously thought to be simple Neolithic monuments. When excavated, these chambers contain preserved grimoires, ritual implements, and most disturbing of all, what appear to be technological devices that predate known metallurgy by centuries. The artifacts exhibit properties that challenge conventional understanding of both history and physics. Metal alloys that shouldn't be possible to create without modern industrial processes. Crystalline structures that generate electromagnetic fields when exposed to specific frequencies. Stone tablets covered in symbols that match patterns found in modern quantum computing research. Several prominent tech entrepreneurs have ancestral ties to Highland families with documented vampire witch connections. Their companies' research divisions have been quietly developing technologies that seem to echo the spiritual energy manipulation techniques described in medieval grimoires. Virtual reality systems that can allegedly influence users' dreams. Artificial intelligence programs trained on datasets that include digitized versions of supposedly destroyed occult manuscripts. Biotechnology projects focused on extending human lifespan through methods that medical ethicists have refused to publicly discuss. The timeline is too precise to be coincidental. Every major breakthrough in these projects occurs shortly after Halloween, when the same families that funded the research gather at their ancestral Highland estates for private celebrations that local authorities have learned not to investigate too closely. The October 31st algorithm, perhaps most unsettling of all, is the growing evidence that modern vampire witches have learned to harvest spiritual energy through digital means. Social media platforms show suspicious activity patterns every Halloween, user engagement that spikes far beyond normal metrics. emotional responses that seem artificially amplified, and content that spreads with viral velocities that defy conventional understanding of information distribution. Data analysts who've studied these patterns report finding algorithmic structures that shouldn't be possible with current programming techniques, code that seems to respond to lunar phases, engagement algorithms that become more aggressive around locations with historical vampire witch activity, user behavior modifications that persist for exactly 1 year after exposure, then reset completely. The implications are staggering. If vampire witches have successfully adapted their soul harvesting techniques to digital platforms, they potentially have access to billions of victims simultaneously. Every Halloween, as people share costume photos, horror movie recommendations, and Halloween party videos, they may unknowingly be participating in the largest spiritual energy collection ritual in human history. The traditional protective measures, blessed silver, iron crosses, sacred salt circles, are useless against supernatural predators who've learned to hunt through fiber optic cables and wireless signals. Modern victims might never even realize they're under attack, their spiritual essence gradually drained through targeted advertisements, personalized content, and social media interactions designed to generate specific emotional responses. The bloodline revelations. Recent DNA analysis has revealed patterns that confirm the most disturbing theories about vampire witch reproduction and genetic inheritance. Unlike traditional folklore that depicts vampirism as a contagious curse, the Scottish vampire witches appear to have maintained distinct genetic bloodlines spanning centuries. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a geneticist whose own family name appears in medieval vampire witch records, has identified chromosomal anomalies present in roughly 0.03% of the Scottish Highland population. These genetic markers correlate with unusual metabolic characteristics, enhanced night vision, extended lifespans, and most significantly, heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, particularly during Halloween night when the Earth's magnetic field shows documented anomalous behavior. The genetic research suggests vampire witches reproduce through carefully planned breeding programs rather than random infection. Family trees show strategic marriages between bloodlines, genetic diversity maintained through calculated breeding choices spanning generations, and inheritance patterns that ensure supernatural abilities pass to selected offspring rather than being diluted through random genetic distribution. But here's where the research becomes deeply personal. Dr. Sinclair's own DNA contains the vampire witch markers. Her investigation began as academic inquiry, but evolved into desperate self-discovery when she realized her own family had been selectively breeding these characteristics for over 4 centuries. Every Halloween since her 21st birthday, she's experienced physical and psychological changes she can't explain through conventional medicine. Her most recent research notes, published just days before she disappeared during a solo research trip to Glen Nevis last October, contained a haunting revelation. The vampire witch bloodlines weren't dying out. They were consolidating. Modern genetic techniques were allowing them to concentrate their supernatural abilities through scientific methods that combined cutting-edge biotechnology with rituals described in medieval grimoires. Dr. Sinclair's final entry simply read, "They're not just harvesting souls anymore, they're engineering them." The Contemporary Gathering, every October 31st. While mainstream media focuses on costume contests and candy consumption, a very different kind of Halloween celebration occurs in the remote Highlands of Scotland. Satellite imagery from the past decade reveals consistent patterns that government authorities have classified under national security protocols. Private aircraft converge on Highland estates with no public access roads. Temporary structures appear overnight around ancient stone circles, sophisticated enough to require professional construction teams, but simple enough to be completely dismantled before dawn. Electromagnetic anomalies that disrupt GPS systems and cellular communications in precisely defined geographic zones. Local residents have learned not to discuss what they observe on these nights. Vehicles that appear to be armored but bear no official markings. Individuals in expensive clothing who move with unnatural grace through terrain that should be impossible to navigate in darkness. Sounds that seem to emerge from the earth itself, chanting in languages that predate recorded history, accompanied by harmonics that make the listener's bones ache with resonance. The few photographs that have emerged, taken by hikers who stumbled into restricted areas despite official warnings, show figures gathered around bonfires that burn without producing smoke. The flames appear to be blue-white rather than orange, casting shadows that seem to move independently of the bodies that should be creating them. In several images, the gathered figures appear to be floating several inches above the ground, their feet never quite touching the earth. But most disturbing are the photographs that capture what happens at midnight. The figures begin to change, their human appearances melting away to reveal forms that combine human intelligence with predatory instincts that evolution never produced. Their eyes reflect light like nocturnal animals. Their movements become fluid in ways that suggest their skeletal structure has become somehow negotiable, and their voices, when they speak, harmonize in frequencies that recording equipment struggles to properly capture. The price of power. Vampire witches' annual power gathering isn't just about sustaining their immortal existence. It's about accumulating influence that extends far beyond supernatural abilities. Financial records obtained through freedom of information requests reveal investment patterns that suggest foreknowledge of major global events. Certain Highland estates, owned by families with documented vampire witch histories, show financial transactions that occurred weeks before major stock market crashes, natural disasters, and political upheavals. Short positions taken just before economic collapses. Real estate purchases in areas that became valuable due to unexpected infrastructure development. Political donations to candidates who won elections despite polling data suggesting they had no chance of victory. The Hibertunanin pattern suggests the vampire witches' soul harvesting rituals grant them more than extended lifespans. They provide access to information about future events. Medieval grimoires described this as temporal scrying, the ability to perceive probable futures by analyzing the spiritual energy patterns of their victims. If someone is destined to die in a future war, their soul essence carries traces of that destiny. By consuming enough souls, vampire witches can map potential timelines with remarkable accuracy. Modern applications of this ability would be worth trillions of dollars. Stock market predictions, political outcome forecasting, early warning systems for natural disasters. The vampire witches don't just hunt for spiritual sustenance. They hunt for insider information about reality itself. But this power comes with costs that may explain why their numbers remain limited. Each Samhain gathering requires enormous spiritual investment. The rituals demand perfect coordination between multiple immortal beings whose individual agendas may conflict. Most critically, the more they manipulate future events for personal gain, the more they risk creating paradoxes that could unravel the very foundations of their supernatural existence. Recent financial market anomalies suggest this balance may be breaking down. Investment patterns associated with vampire witch bloodlines have become increasingly erratic, as if their predictive abilities are being disrupted by forces they can't control. The digital metamorphosis, most significant evolution in vampire witch methodology, may be their adaptation to the digital age, where traditional concepts of proximity and physical presence have become obsolete. If vampire witches can harvest spiritual energy through technological interfaces, their hunting grounds have expanded from Highland glens to global networks. Social media algorithms show suspicious learning patterns that suggest non-human intelligence integration. User emotional states can be manipulated through precisely timed content delivery that triggers specific psychological responses. Dating apps that seem to connect users based on criteria that have nothing to do with romantic compatibility, but everything to do with spiritual energy compatibility. Gaming platforms where certain players demonstrate reaction times and strategic thinking that exceed human biological limitations. The most disturbing evidence comes from tech industry whistleblowers who've reported meeting colleagues who never seem to age, who demonstrate knowledge about company histories that predate their official employment records, and who disappear from work every October 31st, claiming family obligations that require extended leave. These modern vampire witches appear to be using technology not just to hunt more efficiently, but to reproduce their kind through digital means. Virtual reality experiences that can allegedly transfer consciousness between bodies. Artificial intelligence systems trained on datasets derived from medieval grimoires. Blockchain technologies that create permanent, unalterable records of spiritual contracts and soul ownership agreements. If these reports are accurate, the vampire witches aren't just adapting to modern times, they're actively reshaping human technology to serve their supernatural purposes. Every smartphone, every social media account, every digital interaction could potentially be a feeding mechanism for creatures that learned to drain souls before most humans learned to write. Conclusion. The vampire witches of Scottish Samhain represent more than historical curiosity or folklore entertainment. They embody humanity's deepest fear about the price of transcending natural limitations. These beings achieved immortality, accumulated vast knowledge, and gained influence over future events, but only by systematically consuming the spiritual essence of other humans. Their evolution from medieval predators to contemporary power brokers reflects our own technological advancement and moral compromises. We've created global communication networks that can manipulate human behavior on unprecedented scales. We've developed biotechnologies that promise extended lifespans for those who can afford them. We've built economic systems where information asymmetry grants enormous advantages to those with access to privileged knowledge. The question isn't whether vampire witches actually exist. The question is whether we're all becoming them. Every time we harvest personal data from unwilling users, every time we manipulate market conditions through insider knowledge, every time we extend our own advantages at the deliberate expense of others' opportunities, we're following the same path that led Celtic practitioners to offer their mortality in exchange for power. Halloween has become our annual celebration of transformation, where we temporarily adopt the identities of monsters and predators. But what if those costumes aren't disguises? What if they're rehearsals? What if each October 31st, as we play act at being creatures of darkness, we're unconsciously preparing ourselves for a metamorphosis that's already begun? And here's the truly unsettling thought that should keep you awake long after the Halloween decorations come down. If the vampire witches have successfully adapted their soul harvesting techniques to modern technology, how would you even know if you're still entirely human, or if you've already begun the transformation into something that feeds on others to sustain its own existence?